It's my pleasure to open up this next session at NTW23, where I know earlier today you heard that we had over 1,700 registered delegates. Well, by this mid-morning, those numbers had risen to just over 2,200, which I think is phenomenal for a small charity. We are delighted that so many people in very difficult circumstances under so much work pressure are able to join us, so thank you. A recording of this session will be made available on the platform within the next 24 hours. But for now, which is a live session, we'd really welcome your questions and your comments, which you can share either in the the Q&A tab or in the chat tab. And I know at the end, after Paul has presented, he would welcome your thoughts, your comments, your questions. We'd also like to thank the sponsors who have helped to make this whole meeting possible, and also to the supporters from professional bodies, both of whom have exhibitions in the exhibition hall, where there are stands, and on those stands there are booklets and films and all sorts of resources that you can view, you can download, you can chat at different times. So I know the research stand on UK Tren, it has a chat time on it on Thursday. So please do take a look through and make the most of this fantastic platform. But this afternoon, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Bennett, who I feel very fortunate to call a colleague at Thrombosis UK. I never thought I'd be able to, so I'm absolutely thrilled. Paul is a clinical and academic psychologist who has worked in both NHS and universities in Bristol and Cardiff and Swansea. He has previously published research on the psychological impact of VTE and is presently a clinical psychologist providing support for VITT as well as VTE patients in Thrombosis UK's Regain programme. And this afternoon, he's going to be discussing some of the research work he's done in this area, in particular around VITT. So without further ado, let me pass over to Paul. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thank you. There we go. So hello, everybody that I can't see. My name is Paul Bennett, and yes, I'm going to talk about living with VITT, survivors' experiences. And for those of you that don't know, I'm sure you're all aware, but there are various ways you can actually say the full words for VITT. But I'm going to call it vaccine-induced thrombosis and thrombocytopenia, which is a very limited group of people who's developed serious side effects following the AstraZeneca vaccine for COVID. And they may be limited in number, but the impact on each of those individuals has been very significant. So that's what I'd like to talk about. So this is partly based on some clinical work. So in Thrombosis UK, over the last year and 3 months, we've been providing a support service for patients that have had VITT and their relatives, and also based on some research that we are just about to publish, hopefully, in the BMJ Open. I literally 5 minutes before coming on, I submitted our revisions to the journal, and hopefully they'll be accepted and we'll be publishing these data. So what I'm going to talk about is really a combination of my experience of working clinically with these people and also the research that we've done. So I'm a psychologist, and I'm going to talk about the psychological impact. And I suppose the obvious question is, why does this particular condition have such a devastating psychological impact? And I think if you look at the physical side of things, we perhaps can begin to understand why that is. So the classic start of VITT is within 4 to 42 days post-vaccination. And essentially people can either have clots or bleed, and which makes the condition very difficult to treat. And certainly in the early days, people were really struggling to work out how to treat it. And then as knowledge of the condition developed, there were protocols and treatment plans. But in the early days, as we shall see from some of the comments people make, it was difficult to treat. So 4 to 42 days post-vaccination, depending on where those clots are or where the bleed is, people reported a whole bundle of different symptoms, obviously including rather than all of these, but they range from severe headache, visual changes, abdominal pain if the clots are in the abdomen, nausea and vomiting, back pain, shortness of breath, leg pain or swelling, petechiae, and so forth. And these sound moderately, challenging, but are they that bad? But these, as we shall see, people some of these symptoms were very profound, and some people died as a consequence of the condition. These symptoms were highly problematic for many people, not everybody, but many. If people had recovered from these symptoms, then maybe it could be seen as a sort of short-term trauma, which it certainly was. But actually, for many of the people, these conditions or at least symptoms or similar symptoms continue for a long time. So when I first started to see people, it was roughly a year post-vaccination, and still people were having profound physical symptoms. These are just some of the symptoms that people were experiencing. So continuous shortness of breath on activity. So one chap, for example, who was a marathon runner, was reduced to a mobility scooter. So he was having profound difficulties in breathing and fatigue when he tried to walk or go out of the house and so forth. So significantly restricted activities for many people. Reduced physical ability. One person had a heart attack and MI, myocardial infarction. Many people had continued headaches from severe so people would have very specific pain here or here, and which may last for minutes or hours. Other people would have minor buzzing headaches that went on for longer and so forth. Only one person had a limb amputation. Many people reported chronic fatigue, long-term fatigue, and in fact, for those of you that are knowledgeable about COVID, you may recognize some of these symptoms being similar to long COVID. So part of the long COVID symptoms was long-term fatigue. People were having to go to bed during the day to recover, finding day-to-day activities challenging, tiring. And if there were particular stresses in their life, they may deal with them for a day or two, but then have to go to bed and recover for a couple of days and take it very easy at least. Muscle pain, and then these sort of general cognitive challenges of brain fog, memory, concentration issues. And I'll flesh some of those experiences out as we go through. So, you can imagine these sort of the likely impact of these sorts of physical health challenges. And there's a number of things that were particular to this group that made some of these early symptoms and perhaps longer term symptoms more challenging perhaps than even that. In the acute phase, many people were frightened of dying. It actually took surprisingly a long time to get into hospital for many of the people that I've seen. And that is a consistent issue about the difficulties of getting into hospital. There were lots of misdiagnoses, particularly in the early days, but not universally in those days. But when people were in hospital, people were pretty scared, as we shall see from some of the quotes that I'm going to give you from the research that we've done. Also, it was a time of COVID, and so people were in hospital with no visitors. Sometimes people were smuggled in or whatever, but essentially these people were facing fear of death, scary, unexplained symptoms that doctors were saying, we're not quite sure how to treat, at the same time as they were removed from the sort of support that would normally be given to people by direct contact with family members, loved ones, and so forth. Getting in was a problem, as I said. There was often misdiagnosis, and as we'll see, that was surprisingly common, certainly in the early days. And I'm amazed how long people took to get into hospital. There was having quite significant symptoms and saying, oh, we'll wait a little while before we go back, you know, it's not going to be. So part of that delay was people not presenting. Part of that delay was people presenting and often being sent away with, you've got a migraine, as we shall see, you've got other problems. In the longer term, people were facing continued or even new symptoms, and people really didn't understand why they were getting them. You know, headaches, visual problems, fatigue, what's going on? How long is it going to last? You know, why am I getting these? And so people were not just having problems in recovering, but they were having long-term symptoms that were very difficult to deal with, as I've already said. Once people were in care and being looked after, then of course they were getting extremely good care. But then when they came home, there was that sudden shift from, I'm really frightened, I'm having these really scary symptoms, but the medics are here, they can deal with it, to what if it all goes wrong? What if I have problems? How do I get there? How do I get support? So there was quite a difficult transition from hospital to home for many people. And people found it difficult to access services. Hematology, hematologists here, or those that work at this service, were generally seen as really good, but people struggled to get other support. So I put neurology here, but it could have been any other sort of medical. There was people really struggled to get non-hematological support, and yet had illnesses and conditions that were related to those sorts of issues. And then really long-term background stuff is that people were losing jobs, people were dying, people were losing jobs, and yet were struggling to get any sort of financial support. And indeed, the whole world seemed against these people. They put things on Facebook or Twitter, and they'd be removed because they were seen as anti-vax. And they really did get the feeling that their stories were not getting out there. People were not recognizing what was going on. People were being told by their friends. Even one family split up on the grounds that people in the extended family did not believe that the person had had a reaction to the vaccine itself. So there was a lot of disbelief about the cause of the problems, the severity of the problems, and indeed very little support for people that were literally losing their jobs, but having no recourse to financial support. So again, we'll come on to that. So if you look a little bit more technically at likely outcomes for these people, these are very briefly, if you look here, this is PEDVT, I hope you can see this. Roughly a quarter of the people that get PTSD that have a pulmonary embolism or DVT or some other form of clot develop PTSD for quite some considerable time post-event. 38%, 40% go on to have significant anxiety, health anxiety, and so forth. And if you look at patients that go through intensive care, 20% of people on ventilation, even if they're fully cured, so to speak, afterwards, tend to have long-term PTSD. So on that background, you'd expect quite a lot of people to develop problems. And in fact, that's what we found. These data are based on people that were accessing the service, so they are inflated. They're not the norms. But nevertheless, in the early stages of running the service, the support that we gave people, we got people to complete some very relatively brief questionnaires. And what we found was that the PHQ-9, which measures depression, 41% of the people that were coming through were having clinically symptoms relevant to the point that they'd be likely to be diagnosed as having depression if they were seen by a psychiatrist. Anxiety, 50%. The IES is the impact event scale that measures post-traumatic stress disorder, 61%. And clinical levels of health-specific anxiety, 66%. So in purely psychometric terms, certainly the people coming through the service that I've seen clearly have a lot of problems. And I've in the service, we've seen roughly 45, 50 people, which is about 10 to 12% of the UK population that have had VITT. But nevertheless, these may be inflated, but they may not be. There's a lot of people out there that are struggling without necessarily seeking support. So in the study that we did, we actually did a qualitative study where we talked to people and got some of their experiences, and we systematized them and came up with some themes. And this is what we found. So the first theme that we identified, we called the trauma of care. And this is about those short-term experiences. And as I've said, many of them had multiple attempts to access care. They'd go in, they'd say, I've got a severe headache. They'd be told it's a migraine, sent away, come back in a week. You know, I'm not saying the care was bad. Nobody knew what to expect, but for these people, it was difficult and problematic. So one person went to a GP and said, I've got these things. Could it be anything to do with the vaccine? And the GP said, no, it's fake news. It's impossible. There's no chance you can have it. Honestly, it can't happen. So there wasn't that knowledge, perhaps, it's certainly in the early days, that the vaccine could be responsible for these sorts of things. There was one young woman who attended A&E, and she was given oral antacid and asked to attend in 5 days, and she was diagnosed as having gas. And as she put it, I was like, I've had a baby, I had a C-section, and after a C-section, you get tremendous gas. This is not gas. That's what she told the doctor. So he prescribed me a drug for gas that obviously didn't do anything. I didn't have gas. And in fact, this woman went twice to A&E and didn't get in, was given antacids and so forth. And in fact, when she finally got to be seen as having serious problems was actually when she attended for a routine cervical smear, and the nurse said, for goodness sake, you need to get to hospital. So there was confusion. It was difficult to get in. And another woman had a phone call. She was admitted. She was in A&E, sent home, and she had a phone call and saying, your platelets are really low, so just be careful. If you cut yourself, you might bleed to death, but don't come in for a few days because so people found it quite difficult, problematic to access care, which caused lack of trust, lack of faith, concern. What if in the future these things happen? And people were absolutely, or many people were absolutely fearful, terrified for their life. I'll read these quotes. Sorry, they're a bit long and you may not be able to see them as well as I can, but this is from a woman who said, I honestly thought I wasn't going to make it through the night. It was probably the scariest time ever because they wasn't explaining it to me properly. It was almost like the hematologist was excited. I've never seen anyone so excited to be given a diagnosis to someone. He had 2 or 3 other doctors with him every time he came to see me, and it was all smiles and, you know, talking about me like I wasn't there. And it was so scary. Every time I asked them, will I survive this? You know, could this kill me? They said, we don't really know. We don't know enough about it, but you're on the correct treatment. And this is from a gentleman. I knew they thought this could be end of life because that was the only time as you allowed visitors. And he remembers asking his wife, who was allowed to see him, asking her to leave because every time I just kept falling asleep and waking up. And every time I woke up, she was at the end of the bed. I remember asking her to leave. And part of that was, to be honest, that if I was going to die, I didn't want her to see me die. And these are not atypical. A lot of people were reporting similar things. So in hospital, it was pretty scary. Feeling of fraud, there was one person who said she actually didn't have too bad of symptoms and she was surrounded by patients with cancer, and actually she felt a fraud because, you know, there were these people literally dying around her, or terminal care, and she was not too bad. But for most people, there was high levels of fear and anxiety. And as I said, people were isolated. They were not getting their contact with relatives and so forth. And that had the flip side, that for the relatives, it was very difficult because they were not getting feedback. They were not finding out how their relative was actually physically. So as one person said, It was bad for me, but worse for my partner. I was aware of what was happening to me, but he worried because he was left in the dark. And again, that's a very common sort of experience. And here's a plea from a woman, like when you wake up in the middle of the night, remember there was COVID, and I remember crying, going, I just need a human touch. And I remember her, a nurse in ICU, holding my hand, and how much that meant to me. They were really very needy at that particular time for some sort of support. Then in the long term, what were people reporting? This, as I said, there was this transition from hospital where people began to develop a sense of safety and security to going out into the real world where there was much less of that. As AM noted, if there were concerns, investigations occurred within hours in hospital, but took months once discharged. And C, these are all actually not their clear names, not even actually accurate identifiers, but C noted there was no point of call should her condition deteriorate, which they would have found very helpful. And they were struggling to optimize care. As I said, the hematologists were generally seen as amazingly good, but some of the other specialties less so. So this is a woman, she said her neurologist denied her migraine and fatigue were related to VITT. They were chronic migraines due to analgesic addiction, and she had to come off painkillers instantly. And she literally walked out of that appointment crying. You know, she had a diagnosis of VITT, which was not accepted by the neurologist she went to see. And then this is the last one, is the experience of somebody going home with significant health issues. At which point I couldn't walk more than about 100 meters, and that's only if I held someone's hand. I couldn't make it up the stairs. So I remember X holding my hand, and we do one step, and then I have to wait, then we do another step. So it took me quite a few months. So at this point, my parents moved in to be my carer. I couldn't shower, I couldn't stand for long periods of time. I couldn't make it from the kitchen to the living room. And again, clearly not everybody experienced significance to that level, but symptoms to that level, but many did. So there was this struggle to, once they were home, there was getting appropriate care, dealing with the rehab and so forth that people were struggling with. And this was all in the background of continuing significant symptoms. This quote is, I wish I had her initial levels of concentration, but she says, I can't concentrate like I used to. If I were to read a book, I can't remember what I read. It's not that I've got amnesia, it's just that I can't concentrate long enough on something to focus on it and then to remember. I used to be someone who, like, if 10 people walked past me in the street, I could tell you what they were wearing, whether they had glasses. And nowadays they could be running towards me naked and I may not know. You're so used to getting on with things, so all of a sudden you're not able to do that, you know, feeling like you're becoming a burden to others, especially to your loved ones. And that feeling of burden, I don't report much about it here, but one of the things that when we're talking to relatives is how they had to change their lives to accommodate the needs of the patient. So one patient, for example, one person couldn't tolerate noise. You know, he was a big family man, he loved the family, but because of his continuing symptoms, he couldn't tolerate noise, he couldn't tolerate activity, so everybody had to be quiet while they were walking. The kids couldn't come around to the house because it was like, don't get grandpa sort of upset or don't disturb him. So there was a lot of supportive stuff that suddenly changed for these people. So they were a burden, they might have felt a burden. Most of the relatives clearly wanted to support and help these people, but there was a lot of other stuff going on. My main battle while I've been recovering was to get back working, but that's not for me normality. So this is a guy, I won't say what he did, but he made 100 units a month. And that gave them a good good lifestyle, good income, and now he makes 6 to 10 units a month, significantly impaired, but getting no financial support, nothing from the government or whatever. And so that lack of support and wider recognition was really, people are very angry about that. And this is one guy, I get very angry about the lack of acknowledgement. Horrific. No human being should be put through this. I think it's a stark fact that the government produced its own VITT lines in which they recommended psychological support. I've got to get this in, obviously. And they can't even follow up on that. We need to rely on charity, Thrombosis UK, to do that. Somebody really angry about the lack of support that they were getting in a variety of ways, but here rambling about psychology. And this, the other one is a guy who posted stuff about what he was experiencing on Twitter, and some of the comments were hilarious. Yeah, they were. Hope you die. Somebody written, your own fault serves you right. And sadly, he says, I agree with that. The other was repent. I got a few religious people. Yeah, you should repent. I don't think God wants to hear all that. Me repenting is quite funny, actually. You get treated like an insane anti-vaxxer, and a lot of their posts were removed from social media because they were seen as that. And they were having multiple losses: health, future, family. And I've got a couple of quotes here that I think sum it up. It sounds a little bit arrogant if I say it now, but there was a point where I genuinely was, and this is in relation to where I am now, Superman. Whereas now I definitely feel like Clark Kent, who just, you know, he's clumsy, trips over things, he can't run. I'm ashamed of myself and was ashamed I'd become this. I was quite well known, I had a wonderful career, and I missed that life. Because without that and with this illness, I can't see what use I am to anyone now. And I didn't feel invincible before, but I feel a lot less invincible now. So on those grounds, Thrombosis UK set up a support group, support service where we have access to a psychologist or other support, informational support, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole range of different types of support that we've been providing these people. And just to give you, well, no, let's talk about the interventions that we've done, because I can see time's moving on. The issues that we've been largely dealing with are anxiety, coping with intrusive worries, distress, upset. A lot of people get very panicky and have a lot of post-traumatic symptoms, nightmares, intrusive memories. And I won't bore you with the types of intervention that we did, but there are some fairly standard psychological strategies for dealing with those sorts of things. The other thing that people have is depression, as you can imagine from the, I hope you can at least imagine from the experiences I've been recounting. And we've been looking at how to sort of manage some of those depressive episodes. Fatigue, we've been looking at in particular. There's people familiar with COVID and other sort of fatigue-based interventions. There's some quite standardized ways, again, pacing and so forth, of managing fatigue. And a lot of people have got very involved in supporting victims of VITT, as they would see themselves. There's a lot of people who have been lobbying Parliament, working with members of Parliament, involved in working with lawyers and so forth to try and get some what they would see as financial justice. So a lot of people have put a lot of effort into self-help, working together to sort of manage and support each other while they've been doing that. And then, so we have provided and still provide psychology that people can see, but on a wider basis in terms of thrombosis in general. That cohort of people has gradually faded. When I first started, it was a year post thrombosis. So a lot of people came in that year, and there's no extra new people coming along. And so Thrombosis UK is now moving to support patients with a wider set of VTE. And we are providing three things for those people. We are providing psychology support for those that need it, and they can refer in. If they go to the website, they don't need to be referred in. We're providing some leaflets, which we've got here. So there's a link to those, how to cope with worries, how to cope with panic and so forth, which are common outcomes. And we have a less psychological and more informational support for people that have had thrombosis. So I'm working with Anya, one of my colleagues here, and we've sat down with quite a few people talking about what is thrombosis, what's the outcome, what should they be asking their doctors and so forth, which many people get a very good service, but a lot of people, particularly if they go through A&E, given some medication, come back in a month, but that month is very difficult because they're not sure, etc., what it's all about and what they should be doing, etc. So we're sort of shifting our emphasis to a wider support of VTE patients in general for at least a good few months. Phew, that was a breakneck rush. So if anyone's got any questions or comments, I can't actually see them at the moment. So, but if you do or you don't, please throw them at me and I'll be more than happy to have a go at answering them.
Thank you, Paul. That was really informative and very moving as well. And yeah, please do put any comments or questions either in the Q&A or in the chat boxes, and we'll do our best to answer. Just listening through, obviously I know from Thrombosis UK, you're now, you've started off focusing on individuals who've been diagnosed with VITT, and the service, the Regain service, is now expanded slightly to work with some individuals with VTE. But just going back to the VITT patients, have you seen an improvement over the time? Because obviously their situation was so unique and they went in healthy, generally fit, well, for something that they thought would protect them, but in a fluke of science, it changed. And have you seen, as time's gone by, and for instance, this service, which I know was set up because there was just nothing available for them, have you seen it be able to help and improve for some of them?
Yeah, I think one of the sad things is that I've been seeing quite a few people for quite a considerable time, and a lot of people for a moderate amount of time, and their symptoms just don't seem to be improving particularly. There is a slow improvement, but it's very difficult, very challenging. And I think there is increasing anger at the way that the government has actually responded. They see themselves as people that have responded to a public health requirement. They've, in a sense, they've done what the government has asked them. You know, they said have the vaccine, and the government has essentially proven very difficult in getting support. There is something called the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme, which is £120,000, which for some people may be, thank you, may be a lot of money, but for many young people, most of the people I'm seeing are in their 40s, because the older people didn't get VITT, so that was part of the problem. In the early days when the vaccine started, there was no cases of VITT. It's only when it got down to the people really in working age that we began to get see the symptoms of VITT. So a lot of people have lost their jobs, they have big mortgages and so on and so forth, and they are struggling to get money. The VDPS, the criteria, they have to be 60% disabled based on what are, I think, viewed as war injuries or injuries, industrial injuries. So things like headaches, things like fatigue really don't count towards some of the problems that actually get you over that 60% hurdle. So there's a lot of anger about the way that they're being treated by the government and so forth. In terms of psychologically, of course, they've seen me, they're bound to be getting better. And a lot of them are, thank goodness, but they're still, you know, a lot of them would see it as coping with continued symptoms, coping with the way that they're not being particularly well supported. And I think it's quite interesting at the moment that if you read, it's interestingly enough, all the papers I don't read, things like the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, and the Telegraph, there's actually a lot of commentary at the moment about the VDPS. So it does look like there is a sort of increase in interest, and maybe things will change for these people. At the same time, as advocates like Christopher Choke are giving talks about VITT to literally an empty House of Parliament. Everybody walked out when he started to talk about it in a very coherent and moving way. So people, yeah, I mean, people are getting increasingly angry. They're dealing with it better, but they're still dealing with it, and they still feel a neglected group.
I can imagine it must be extremely frustrating. And I know I've noticed more questions are being raised in Parliament, but that doesn't always further things on. And we are 18 months, 2 years now on for those individuals. You mentioned you've got a paper hopefully due to be published. Is there more research data coming out as well that you're aware of?
In terms from us, in terms of psychology, I don't know the medicine at all. I'm sure there's lots coming out. But we've got a paper on the patient's experience, as I say, just hopefully about to hit the streets. And we've also done a series of interviews with the relatives, family members of both people who survived and families where someone has actually died as a result of the vaccine. And I have to be honest, I found the experiences of the patients very moving, but the families are equally moving. Not just those that died, but things like, how do you tell the how do you explain to the kids that daddy or mummy, who was this lively, engaged person, has now become somebody who can't do this, can't do that, doesn't engage. How do you look after those? How do you deal with the financial stresses and strains? The family members, I think, are just going through a different experience, but nevertheless, just as moving an experience and challenging experience as the patients in many ways. So that should be forthcoming in the next few months.
It is dreadful, and it goes on for them every day, regardless of the time, as you say, because of the physical and the mental trauma and injuries they've suffered or loss. For this audience, though, I know that some of the work you've done with VITT patients and also doing VT, you're developing some tools which we hope will be of benefit to healthcare providers in how you communicate, because while so much around VITT we didn't know, and that was a huge learning thing, the way of communication is also key. So could you, we've got in the last few minutes, explain what sort of tools or resources are you working on that we hope will bring benefit to improving that communication?
Yes, Joe.
I'm not like that. No.
I'm for publicity. No, we are hopeful. Well, we are in the process of developing some podcasts and some hopefully teaching. I can't think of the word, technology, whatever, to support people. Looking at communicating, teaching some basic psychological skills and so forth. And the aim is we're going to get a bunch of patients that have been through it to talk about their experiences of what they've gone through. We're going to get some health professionals talking about their experiences, tying them in. And in the middle of that, there'll be some informational things led by me. So we're hoping that will sort of tie in to sort of bring those two perspectives. And I think it's really quite powerful, because when I was talking to a consultant about communication, and a consultant that is absolutely loved by his patients, this is not a bad communicator. We were just talking, and it was like, oh, perhaps I could do this, perhaps I could do that. Right, what I'm going to do is go away, and next time I see them, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. And even somebody that I think will be seen as a good communicator actually found it useful to reflect and to think and to engage in that sort of process that we're hoping to bring. So these will be online, people can access them and go through them as a sort of triple on each of these issues. And you know, part of the aim is how can you help these people psychologically? And I think, oh my God, we've only got 2 minutes with patients. How are we supposed to do this? But the aim is to give some very simple stuff that we augment by the online. You know, we've got coping with worries, which we're going to develop a little bit further as well. So hopefully there'll be resources that people can access that can provide that psychological support without you as healthcare professionals having to provide it, but you can do the entree, you can make people aware. And I think, you know, that for me, I was just seeing someone today with tremendous problems, but I think the critical thing is, you know, these people don't have mental health problems. These people have a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And I think, you know, when talking about mental health in these people, yes, they're anxious, yes, they might get depressed, but it is a reasonable response to something dreadful that has happened to them. And I think that normalization, if nothing else, is absolutely key. So there's a few little things that we can do in you know, communicating with these people that don't need high technology, but can nevertheless really support them. And that's the aim of this educational material.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't trying to promote, I was trying to take out of a very dire, awful situation, something that could be helpful to many other situations, and certainly learning about listening and communicating. In an earlier session this morning, somebody was on about, you know, asking what's important, and at the end asking, now what have you heard me explain? Because what we hear and what's important to us may be very different from either side of that consultation desk.
Well, sorry, I'm gonna, yeah, I mean, medics and medical people in general tend to have a medical agenda. Patients tend to have a psychosocial agenda with a little bit of medicine, and those can be mutually beneficial, but it means a lot can get lost because people are talking about and have a different focus and a different interest. And it is meshing. It's almost like, what do you call it? I don't know, those round circles that come together. It's having that sort of central element where there's enough medicine, enough psychosocial, and there's that meshing that people can work on. I think that's the skill and the sort of thing that patients benefit most from.
Okay, thank you very much. A really interesting talk, and we hope things will progress, but it is a very difficult situation for those who are affected by VITT. Thank you so much for the insight. Thank you to the audience for attending. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this talk will be available as a recording very shortly within the platform. So if you've missed it or you want a colleague to come and watch it, it will be there. But for now, thank you very much. Thank you, Paul.